Sir, my name is Pete McAllister. I write you because my friend will not write for himself. The voice that spoke those words was the voice of a tall woman. The woman was sitting at a small wooden kitchen table. The table was in the back of a small bright agency office on Main Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. The day was the 10th of January in the year 1884. The woman's name was Alma Whitcomb. She was 36 years old. She was a widow. She had been a midwife and a healer in St. Joseph for the last 4 years. She had come into the bride agency office that morning because the rent on her small cabin was 3 weeks past due. She had $2.40 to her name. The man who handed her the letter was the agency owner. His name was Mr. Theo Brand. He was a small, thin man in a black wool coat. He had a small gray beard. His hands were always cold. He had given Alma the letter and a tin cup of weak coffee and a chair by his iron stove. He had said, "Read it, Mrs. Whitcomb. Take your time. The man who sent it has paid the full advance." Alma had taken the letter. She had opened it. She had read the first line aloud, because she had been taught by her own mother to read important things aloud the first time. She read the next line. "My friend lives 10 miles north of the town of Cold Creek in Wyoming Territory. His cabin sits on a ridge above the creek. His name is Reuben Halstead. He is 46 years old. He was shot in the chest by a horse thief 6 months ago. The wound has not healed. The town doctor in Cold Creek will not ride out to him. The wound is closing badly. My friend will be dead by the end of the spring. He will not write to a woman for help. So I am writing for him." Alma stopped reading. She looked up at Mr. Brand. She said, "Mr. Brand." He said, "Mom." She said, "This man is dying." He said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "He needs a doctor. He does not need a bride." Mr. Brand looked at his hands. He looked back at her. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, please read the rest." She read, "I am not asking you for a young bride. I am not asking you for a pretty bride. I am asking you for a strong woman who knows herbs. I have spoken to the freight man who runs the St. Joseph route. He told me there is a healer in St. Joseph who is a widow and who has not been called by a doctor in your town for any patient she has lost. He said her name is Alma Whitcomb. I am paying the agency the full advance of $200 in gold. The advance is hers to keep, whether she comes or not. If she comes, the train fare to Cheyenne is paid. The wagon from Cheyenne to Cold Creek is paid. A man named Caleb Rose will meet her at the Cold Creek depot with a buckboard. I will not be at the depot. My friend Reuben Halstead does not know I am writing this letter. He will not know until she walks in his door." Alma set the letter down on the small wooden table. She did not say anything for a long second. She looked at the iron stove. She looked at her own hands. She looked at the tin cup of weak coffee. She said, very low, "Mr. Brand." He said, "Mom." She said, "The dying man does not know I am being sent." He said, "He does not," she said. "If I get to that cabin and he turns me away, the agency does not pay back the $200. He said, "The agency does not. The $200 is yours." She said, "If I get to that cabin and he is dead, the agency does not pay back the $200. He said, "The agency does not." She said, "If I get to that cabin and I save him, the agency does not collect a finder's fee." He said, "The man who wrote this letter, Mr. McAllister, said he would not have it any other way. He said the $200 was hers in any case. He said he was not buying a bride. He said he was buying his friend's last chance." Alma Whitcomb looked at the letter on the table. She picked it up. She folded it. She slid it back into the envelope. The envelope was the kind of soft brown paper a frontier storekeeper sells for wrapping a parcel. The seal on the back was made of plain red wax with the letter R pressed into it. She said, "Mr. Brand, I will go." He said, "Ma'am," she said, "bring me the train tickets. I will be on the train tomorrow morning." He stood up. He went to the small wooden desk at the back of the office. He brought back a small brown envelope. The brown envelope held 3 train tickets and a wagon receipt, and a small folded paper map of the Cold Creek Road. She took them. She put them in the deep pocket of her wine-red wool dress. She picked up the letter again. She looked at the back of the envelope. She looked at the red wax seal. She looked at the letter R. She said, in a voice nobody else heard but herself, "Mr. Halstead, I am coming." She walked out of the bride agency office. The snow was falling on Main Street. She walked the 4 blocks to her small cabin. She did not cry. She had not cried in 4 years. But she sat at her own kitchen table for 1 hour with the letter in her hands. She read the first line over again. "Sir, my name is Pete McAllister. I write you because my friend will not write for himself." She thought about her own dead husband, Henry Whitcomb. He had not written for help either. He had ridden out on the day the cholera came down the river. He had not come back. She had been a widow for 4 years. She had not, in those 4 years, met a single man who would write to a stranger for help. A man had now written. She folded the letter. She put it in the small carved oak box on her kitchen mantel. The box held her dead mother's wedding band and the small silver locket her dead husband had given her. The box would from that day also hold the letter. She started to pack. The man who held the pen was Pete McAllister. Pete McAllister was 61 years old. He had been a fur trapper in his younger years. He had been a freight wagon driver after that. He had stopped driving freight at 54 because his back had given out. He had built a small log cabin 12 miles north of Cold Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1879. He had moved into the cabin alone. He had been alone in that cabin for the 4 years that followed. His nearest neighbor was Reuben Halstead. Reuben lived 2 miles further up the ridge. Pete and Reuben had been friends since the day Pete had moved in. They had met at the creek that runs between the 2 cabins. Pete had been fixing a leaky bucket. Reuben had walked down from his ridge to help. They had not spoken much that first day. They had not needed to. In the 4 years since, the 2 men had eaten supper together on most Sundays. They had taken turns hosting. They had not in 4 years talked about their wives. Both of them had been widowers, Pete since 1864, Reuben since 1872. They had not in their friendship found the need to talk about it. In the autumn of 1883, on a clear, cold October morning, Reuben Halstead had ridden up to the high pasture above his cabin to check his elk traps. He had been alone. He had been carrying his Sharps rifle. He had not been carrying a sidearm. 3 horse thieves had been waiting in the high pasture. The thieves had not expected Reuben to ride up that morning. They had been hiding in the pines. They had seen Reuben before he had seen them. The lead thief had shot Reuben in the chest with a pistol. The bullet had gone in below the right collarbone. The bullet had passed through the lung. The bullet had come out at the back. Reuben had not died. He had fallen off his horse. The horse had bolted. The thieves had taken the horse. They had not come down to finish Reuben. They had thought he was dead. They had ridden out of the high pasture with the horse, and they had gone south, through the pass. Reuben Halstead had lain in the high pasture for 14 hours. He had not been found until the next morning. Pete McAllister had found him. Pete had ridden up the ridge at sunrise because Reuben had not come down for his Sunday supper the night before. Pete had ridden right to the high pasture. He had found Reuben in a small drift of pine needles. Reuben had been blue at the lips. Reuben had been breathing. Pete had loaded Reuben on his own horse. He had ridden Reuben down to Reuben's cabin. He had set Reuben on the bed. He had ridden into Cold Creek for the doctor. The doctor in Cold Creek was named Dr. Lyle Pomeroy. Dr. Pomeroy had said he could not ride out to Reuben because the road was bad. Dr. Pomeroy had been wrong about the road. The road had been fine. Pete had asked him a second time. Dr. Pomeroy had said no. Pete had ridden back to Reuben's cabin. He had cleaned the wound himself with hot water and salt. He had stitched the wound with the silk thread he had used for years to mend his own boots. He had bound the wound with a clean shirt cut into strips. The wound had not closed. For 4 months, Pete had ridden up the ridge every day. He had brought broth. He had brought boiled wool. He had brought what small medicine he could get at the Cold Creek dry goods store. He had read the small herb book his own dead wife had left him. He had used the herbs he could find on the ridge: yarrow, plantain leaf, bare root. He had done what he could. The wound had still not closed. By the second week of December, Pete had known the truth. Reuben Halstead was going to die. The wound was not closing because the bullet had nicked a small place inside the lung that Pete did not know how to fix. The fever came and went. The breath was rough. Reuben had lost 22 pounds. Reuben had stopped trying to stand. Pete had sat at the kitchen table in his own cabin on the night of the 17th of December. He had cried for an hour. Pete McAllister had not cried since 1864. He had cried that night. Then Pete had pulled out a piece of brown paper. He had pulled out a small bottle of black ink. He had pulled out his old steel nib pen. He had written a letter. The letter was the letter that Alma Whitcomb had read aloud in the back office of the bride agency in St. Joseph, Missouri, on the morning of the 10th of January, 1884. Pete had paid the $200 in gold for the advance out of his own savings. The $200 was the last of the money he had earned in 27 years of trapping and freighting. He had not minded. He had said to himself, sitting at the kitchen table, with the letter sealed and the candle burning low, "If a friend will not let you spend your last gold on him, he is not your friend. Reuben is my friend." He had not told Reuben. He had told Reuben, on the morning of the 18th, only that the freight man would be bringing some supplies from St. Joseph. He had told Reuben to expect a visitor sometime in the second week of January. He had not told him who. Reuben had said, in the rough breath he had been breathing for 4 months, "Pete, I do not need a visitor." Pete had said, "Reuben, you do not get to choose." Reuben had said, "Pete." Pete had said, "Reuben." Reuben had said, "All right." He had closed his eyes. He had gone back to sleep. Pete had ridden down to Cold Creek that same morning. He had paid the freight man $5 to ride the letter to St. Joseph by the fastest route. He had paid Caleb Rose, the buckboard driver, $3 to be at the Cold Creek depot on every train day between the 8th and the 20th of January. He had ridden back up the ridge. He had waited. He had not in the 3 weeks of waiting told Reuben. He would not tell Reuben until the morning Alma Whitcomb's wagon was at the foot of the ridge. That morning was still 6 days away from the morning Alma Whitcomb read the first line of the letter aloud at the bride agency office in St. Joseph. The cabin at the top of the ridge waited. Alma Whitcomb had been a widow for 4 years. Her dead husband had been Henry Whitcomb. Henry had been a river boat engineer on the Missouri River. He had been a quiet man. He had been a kind man. He had been 6 years older than Alma. They had married in the spring of 1875. They had not had any children. They had not had any children because Alma's body had not allowed it. She had been told the same thing 2 of the healers in earlier scripts had been told. Her body would not carry a child to term. She had been told by a St. Joseph doctor in 1877. She had been told the truth. Henry had not minded. Henry had said, on the night the doctor had told them, sitting on the small porch of their small cabin on the river road, "Alma, I did not marry you for the children. I married you for the bread you bake on a Sunday." She had laughed. She had cried. She had laughed again. She had been married to Henry for 5 years. Henry had died of cholera in the summer of 1880. The cholera had come down the river that summer. Henry had been on the boat. The boat had docked at a small town downriver. The cholera had come on board. Henry had been one of the 11 men on the boat who had died. He had not made it home. The boat company had paid Alma $42. The $42 had been a death benefit. The $42 had not been enough for a year of rent. Alma had been 32 when Henry died. She had been a midwife since she was 18. She had learned the herbs from her own mother, who had been a midwife in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She had taken her medicine satchel and her cabin and her small carved oak box of her mother's wedding band and her dead husband's small silver locket and she had started the practice. She had run the practice for 4 years. She had caught 54 babies in 4 years. She had not lost a mother. She had grown from a size 17 to a size 20. She had not minded the growth. She had eaten what was put on her table by the women who paid her in cornmeal and salt pork and the small kindnesses of frontier neighbors. She had stayed strong. She had stayed steady. She had stayed alone. By the autumn of 1883, the river boat trade had begun to slow. The railroad had taken most of the work. The towns along the river had begun to empty. The women along the river had begun to follow their husbands west. The practice had not slowed for a year. Then it had slowed all at once. By December of 1883, Alma had been catching 1 baby a month. By the first week of January 1884, she had not been called for 2 weeks. Her rent had been 3 weeks past due. Her wood box was almost empty. Her flour bin had been at the bottom for a week. She had walked down Main Street on the morning of the 10th of January 1884 because she had not known what else to do. She had passed the bride agency window. She had stopped. She had looked at the small printed sign in the window. The sign had said, in plain black letters, "Strong, healthy women needed for frontier households. Passage paid. Small advance offered." Alma had read the sign twice. She had walked in. Mr. Theo Brand had taken her name. He had taken down her age, her trade, her widow status, her size, her health, her town. He had said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, there is 1 letter on my desk this morning that named you by name. Will you read it?" She had said, "By name." He had said, "By name." She had said, "Then I will read it." She had read it. She had said yes. She had walked the 4 blocks home. She had sat at her kitchen table. She had read the letter again. She had thought about her 4 years of widowhood. She had thought about the 4 years of not being asked for any small thing by any man. She had thought about the river boat company that had paid her $42 and had not written her another letter since. She had thought, at last, about Henry. She had thought about what Henry would have said if he were sitting at the kitchen table across from her with the letter in his hand. She had known what Henry would have said. Henry would have said, "Alma, there is a man on a ridge in Wyoming who is dying. Go." She had packed. She had packed the medicine satchel her mother had left her. She had packed the small carved oak box. She had packed 3 plain wool dresses. She had packed Henry's wedding band, which she had kept in the small carved oak box beside her own. She had packed her grandmother's herb book. She had packed the small silver locket. She had packed the brown letter and the $200 in gold that Mr. Brand had given her in a small leather pouch. She had not packed any soft things. She had not packed a single picture frame. She had not packed Henry's pipe, which had been on the mantel for 4 years. She had set the pipe, careful, in the small wooden box at the back of the wardrobe. She had been at the train depot at 6 in the morning on the 11th of January. The train had pulled out at 6:15. She had watched the lights of St. Joseph fall away. She had not cried. She had said low into the window of the train car, "Henry, I am going west." She had thought she heard, somewhere inside her own head, Henry's slow voice say back, "Alma." Good. She had slept the first 100 miles. The train from St. Joseph to Cheyenne ran 4 days. Alma Whitcomb traveled in the second-class car. The second-class car was warm. The car was full of men. 3 of the men were freighters. 4 were railroad workers. 2 were ranchers riding west to look at land. The men had been polite to Alma. The men had given up the seat by the window for her on the first day. The men had not, in 4 days, asked her business. She had been grateful. She had not slept well. She had eaten little. She had read the letter once a day. Each time she had read it, she had folded it back into the brown envelope and slipped it into the deep pocket of her wine-red wool dress. She had reached Cheyenne on the night of the 14th of January. She had stayed in a small hotel near the depot. The hotel was clean. The bed was hard. The breakfast was warm. She had paid the hotel bill from the $200 pouch. She had bought a new pair of wool stockings and a small tin of bear grease for her own boots. The Cheyenne air was colder than she had thought it would be. The wagon from Cheyenne to Cold Creek had left at 6 in the morning on the 15th. The wagon had been a small enclosed stage. The stage had carried 3 other passengers. 2 were ranch hands going home. 1 was a small Methodist minister riding to a wedding at Cold Creek. The minister had been a kind, round-faced man named Reverend Jonas Pike. He had a wife at home. He had 3 children. He had been 72 years old. He had spoken to Alma on the first afternoon. He had said, "Mom, you are riding to Cold Creek," she had said. "I am." He had said, "You are riding alone." She had said, "I am." He had said, "May I ask your business in Cold Creek?" She had thought for a long second. She had decided to tell him the truth. She had said, "Reverend, I am riding to the cabin of a man named Reuben Halstead. The man does not know I am coming. The man is dying. His friend wrote me a letter asking me to come. The friend's name is Pete McAllister. I am going to try to save the man." The Reverend had not said anything for a long second. Then he had said, "Mom, may I ask what you do?" She had said, "I am a healer. I am a midwife. I have stitched gunshot wounds 3 times in my 4 years of practice. I have closed 1 chest wound. The chest wound healed." The Reverend had nodded. He had said, "Mom, what is your name?" She had said, "Alma Whitcomb." He had said, "Mrs. Whitcomb. I have been to Cold Creek twice. I have met Pete McAllister. I have not met Reuben Halstead, but I have heard of him. The men of the freight depot speak of him as a quiet man. They speak of Pete McAllister as a man who has had to ride down to the doctor in Cold Creek. 4 times this autumn for medicine the doctor would not give. I think you have been called by a good man for a good reason." She had said, "Reverend, thank you." He had said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, may I pray with you?" She had said yes. He had bowed his head. He had prayed a small, quiet, plain prayer. He had asked the Lord to keep Alma Whitcomb safe. He had asked the Lord to keep Reuben Halstead alive until she got there. He had asked the Lord to keep her hands steady when she walked in the door. He had said, "Amen." She had said, "Amen." The wagon had rolled west across the Wyoming plains for 2 more days. On the morning of the 17th of January, the wagon had crested a small rise. The driver had pointed forward. He had said, "Cold Creek, Mom. The town is in the small valley below us." The town of Cold Creek was small. The town held about 300 people. The main street ran north and south. The street had a hotel, a general store, a smithy, a small Methodist church, a small office building, a livery, and a doctor's office. The doctor's office was at the south end of the street. The cabin of Dr. Lyle Pomeroy. Alma Whitcomb stepped down from the wagon at the Cold Creek depot at noon. A tall, thin man in a dark wool coat was waiting beside a buckboard. The man held a small folded piece of brown paper in his hand. The buckboard was hitched to a brown mare. The man stepped forward. He said, "Mom, are you Mrs. Whitcomb?" She said. "I am," he said. "My name is Caleb Rose. Pete McAllister sent me. I am to drive you up the ridge to Pete's cabin. You will spend the night at Pete's cabin. Pete will ride you up to Reuben's cabin in the morning." She said, "Mr. Rose, thank you." He said, "Mom, may I take your trunk?" She said, "You may." He loaded her trunk into the buckboard. He helped her up onto the seat. He climbed up beside her. He turned the brown mare. The buckboard pulled out of the Cold Creek depot. They rode north out of Cold Creek along a narrow road. The road climbed into the hills. The hills were covered in pine. The snow was deep in the trees. The road took 2 hours. They reached Pete McAllister's cabin at 2:30 in the afternoon. Pete McAllister was waiting on the porch. Pete McAllister was a tall, thin man with white hair and a white beard. He wore a thick brown wool coat. He wore a wide-brimmed hat. He held the hat in his hand. He stepped down off the porch as the buckboard pulled up. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Mr. McAllister." He looked at her face. He looked at the wine-red wool dress. He looked at the small leather medicine satchel on her lap. He said, "Mom, you came." She said, "I came." He said, "Mom, he does not know you are here." She said, "I know." He said he will not be glad. He will be angry with me. He may be angry with you, she said. I know. He said, Mom, will you eat supper at my table tonight? We will ride up to his cabin at sunrise. I will tell him you have come. I will tell him I wrote the letter without his leave. He will be angry. He will be angry at me, not at you. When his anger has passed, he will let you set your hands on the wound. He will not say no to your hands. I know him, she said, Mr. McAllister. I will eat supper at your table. He helped her down off the buckboard. He took her trunk. He carried it into the cabin. The cabin was small. The cabin was warm. The cabin smelled of pine and salt pork and fresh coffee. She sat by his iron stove. She drank a cup of coffee. She did not say much. He did not say much. But before they ate supper, Pete McAllister sat across from her at the table. He put his hands flat on the wood. He said, Mom, I will tell you one thing. I wrote the letter because Reuben Halstead is the best friend I have had in 27 years. He saved my life 3 winters ago in a snowstorm. He has fed me through 2 winters when my back was bad. He is going to die unless someone who knows wounds better than I do walks in his door. I have spent my last gold on you. I do not regret a single coin. If you can save him, I will be in your debt for the rest of my days. If you cannot save him, I will still be in your debt, she said. Mr. McAllister, he said. Mom, she said. I will do my best, he said. Mom, your best will be enough. They ate supper. She slept in the small spare bed in the back room of the cabin. She slept hard. She woke at 5. The lamp at her bedside was lit. Pete McAllister was at the small kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. The wagon was hitched outside. The brown mare was ready. He said, Mom, she said, I am ready. She picked up her medicine satchel. She walked out into the cold morning. The ride from Pete McAllister's cabin to Reuben Halstead's cabin took 45 minutes. The road climbed. The snow was deep. The brown mare worked hard. Pete McAllister did not speak for the first 30 minutes. Alma Whitcomb did not speak either. She held the medicine satchel in her lap. The satchel was heavy. She did not mind. At the last switchback, Pete pulled the wagon up. He turned to her. He said, Mom, I will go in first. I will tell him. I will ask him to let you in. When he says yes, I will come out to the porch. I will wave you in. Will that suit you? She said, Mr. McAllister, that will suit me. He drove the wagon up to the small porch of the cabin. The cabin was small. The cabin had 1 window. The window glass was clean. There was smoke rising from the chimney. The smoke was thin. Pete climbed down from the wagon. He went up the small porch steps. He knocked on the door. A voice from inside said in a rough breath, Come in, Pete. Pete went in. Alma Whitcomb stayed on the wagon. She did not move. She listened. She could hear the voices through the door. She could not hear the words. She could hear that the second voice was rough and tired. She could hear that the second voice rose after 1 minute to a hard pitch. She could hear Pete McAllister's slow, steady voice answering. She could hear the second voice rise again. She could hear it fall. She could hear it rise again. She waited. After 10 minutes, Pete McAllister came out onto the porch. He looked tired. He waved her in. She climbed down off the wagon. She walked up the small porch steps. She crossed the porch. She walked through the door. The cabin inside was small. The cabin had a small iron stove on the back wall. The cabin had a small bed against the side wall. The cabin had a small kitchen table in the middle of the room. The cabin smelled of dried sweat and wood smoke, and the small, sharp smell of a wound that had not been clean in some time. On the bed was a man. The man was Reuben Halstead. Reuben Halstead was lying on his back. He was thin. He was very thin. His face was pale. His beard was long. His hair was dark and damp. His eyes were the gray of cold creek water. His eyes were on her face. She set her medicine satchel down on the kitchen table. She did not move toward him. She said, Mr. Halstead. He said, in his rough breath, Mrs. Whitcomb. She said, Mr. McAllister has told you why I am here. He said, he has. She said, Mr. Halstead, I have not come to marry you. He looked at her for a long second. He said, you have not. She said, I have not. I have come because Mr. McAllister wrote me a letter. The letter named you. The letter named your wound. The letter said you would die without a healer. The letter said no doctor in your town would ride out to you. The letter said you would not write for help yourself. I have come for the wound. I have not come for the bride agency, he said in his rough breath. Pete. You hear that? Pete said from the porch door. I hear that, Reuben. Reuben said, Pete, you wrote her a letter you should not have written. Pete said, I wrote her a letter you should have written 6 months ago. Reuben closed his eyes. He opened them. He looked at Alma Whitcomb. He said, Mrs. Whitcomb. She said, Mr. Halstead. He said, I have been shot in the chest for 6 months. The wound has not closed. The fever comes and goes. I have lost 22 pounds. I cannot stand. I do not pretend to think I will be alive in April. If you have come for the wound, you may look at the wound. If you cannot do anything for the wound, you will leave at sunrise with Pete. If you can do something for the wound, you may stay until the wound is closed. I will pay you in gold from the small box on the high shelf. I will pay you what the work is worth. You will not be paid for any reason other than the work. She said, Mr. Halstead, that suits me. He said, Mrs. Whitcomb. She said, Mr. Halstead, he said, there is a small narrow room off the back of this cabin. The room was my dead wife's sewing room. The room has a bed. The bed is clean. The bed will be yours while you are here. I will sleep where I am. Pete will sleep on a bedroll by the stove if he stays. The door of the small narrow room closes. The door has a small wooden latch. You will not be disturbed, she said, Mr. Halstead. Thank you. She picked up her medicine satchel. She walked to the small narrow room at the back of the cabin. She set the satchel on the small wooden chair by the small bed. She came back out. She crossed the cabin to the bed. She knelt at the side of the bed. She said, Mr. Halstead, may I unbutton your shirt? He said, you may. She unbuttoned his shirt. The cloth peeled back. The wound was below the right collarbone. The wound was the size of a small silver dollar. The skin around the wound was red. The skin was puffy. There was a small amount of yellow seeping from the center of the wound. The center of the wound was a small dark hole the size of a kernel of corn. She set her ear against the side of his chest. She listened. She set her hand on his forehead. She felt the heat. She lifted her head. She looked at his face. She said, Mr. Halstead. He said, Mrs. Whitcomb. She said, there is a piece of bullet jacket inside the wound. The piece is small. The piece is the reason the wound has not closed. The piece must come out. When the piece is out, the wound will close. I have done this twice before. The second time was 3 winters ago. The wound closed in 9 days. He said, how do you take the piece out? She said, I use a small narrow probe. I use a small narrow forceps. I use boiled water. I use carbolic. I use my hands. He said, will it hurt? She said, Mr. Halstead, it will hurt. It will hurt very much. I have a small bottle of laudanum in my satchel. The laudanum will dull the pain. The laudanum will not stop the pain. I will work fast. I will work clean. The work will take less than an hour. After the work, you will sleep. You will sleep for 2 days. When you wake up on the 3rd day, the fever will be gone. The wound will be closing. He looked at her for a long second. He said, Mrs. Whitcomb. She said, Mr. Halstead. He said, take the piece out. She said, I will. Pete will hold your good hand. I will need an hour. I will start when the kettle is at a boil. She stood up. She walked to the iron stove. She set the kettle on. Pete McAllister stepped through the porch door. He came across the cabin. He knelt at the side of the bed. He took Reuben Halstead's good left hand in his own right hand. He held it. He said, Reuben, I am here. Reuben said, Pete, you wrote her a good letter. Pete said, I wrote her the only letter I had in me. Reuben closed his eyes. The kettle began. On the back of the iron stove, its slow, steady climb toward boil. The piece of bullet jacket came out at 20 minutes past noon. The piece was small. The piece was the size of a kernel of corn. The piece was made of brass. The brass had been bent by the bone. The brass had a small jagged hook at one end. The hook had been holding the wound open for 6 months. Alma Whitcomb laid the piece on a clean linen square on the small wooden tray she had set on the kitchen table. She washed her hands in the basin of hot water. She did not look at Reuben Halstead's face. Reuben had not screamed. He had grunted twice. He had gone white. He had gripped Pete McAllister's hand so hard that Pete had a bruise across the knuckles for a week. But Reuben had not screamed. Alma cleaned the wound with carbolic. She closed the wound with 7 small stitches. The thread was the silk thread her mother had given her in 1872. The needle was the small steel needle she had kept clean for 10 years. She bound the wound with a small linen pad and a long, clean strip of cotton, wrapped twice around his chest and tied at the side. She washed her hands again. She turned around. She crossed the cabin to the bed. She said, "Mr. Halstead?" He did not open his eyes. He said, in a small, dry voice, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "The piece is out. The wound is closed. You will sleep now. Pete and I will be in the cabin. You will not be alone." He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Mr. Halstead, you are welcome." He slept. He slept for 2 days. Pete McAllister sat at the bedside for the first night. Alma Whitcomb sat at the bedside for the second night. They took turns. They drank coffee. They ate the salt pork and the cornbread Pete had brought up from his own cabin. They did not speak much. They did not need to. On the morning of the 3rd day, Reuben Halstead opened his eyes. The fever was gone. The wound under the bandage was clean. The breath in his chest was steady. He looked at Alma Whitcomb across the small kitchen table. Alma was eating a small bowl of oatmeal. She had her gray wool shawl over her wine-red wool dress. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "I am still alive." She said, "You are." He said, "How is the wound?" She said, "The wound is clean. The wound is closing. By the count of the next 10 days, the wound will be closed. The skin will pink. The fever will not come back." He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Yes." He said, "You said you could do this. You did this." She said, "I did." He said, "Where is Pete?" She said, "Pete rode down to his cabin this morning. Pete will be back at noon." Pete has been carrying salt pork and cornbread up the ridge for 4 days. Pete needs to sleep in his own bed. He nodded. He looked at the small kitchen table. He looked at the small leather medicine satchel beside her chair. He looked at the small carved oak box on the mantel above the iron stove that he had not noticed had been added to the mantel in the last 3 days. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Yes." He said, "There is a small carved oak box on my mantel that was not on my mantel a week ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "What is in it?" She said, "Mr. Halstead, the box is mine. The box was my mother's. The box holds a wedding band. The wedding band was hers. The box also holds the small silver locket my dead husband gave me. The box also holds the brown letter Pete McAllister wrote to the bride agency in St. Joseph." He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Yes." He said, "May I read the letter?" She said, "Mr. Halstead, you may." She stood up. She walked across the cabin. She took the box down. She opened the box. She took out the brown letter. She walked back to the bed. She handed him the letter. He took the letter. He held the letter in his good left hand. He said, "Will you read it to me? My eyes are still tired." She said, "Mr. Halstead, I will." She sat down on the small wooden chair beside the bed. She unfolded the brown letter. She read. She read the first line. "Sir, my name is Pete McAllister. I write you because my friend will not write for himself." She read the next paragraph. She read about the wound. She read about Reuben Halstead. She read about Dr. Lyle Pomeroy, who would not come. She read about the freight man who had told Pete about the healer in St. Joseph. She paused. She said, "Mr. Halstead, there is one more paragraph in this letter that you have not heard. The paragraph is at the end. The paragraph is the part Mr. Brand at the bride agency did not let me read out loud in his office. The paragraph is in Pete McAllister's hand." He said, "Read it." She read it. "To Mrs. Alma Whitcomb, if you save Reuben Halstead, you will not be in his debt. You will not be in mine. You will only be in the small debt of having walked into a cabin where a good man would have died alone, and having sat at his bedside until he was alive enough to thank you for it. I will pay the $200 in gold whether you save him or not. I will not ask you to marry him. I will not ask you anything. I am not the man to ask any woman to do anything she did not come to do. I will only ask you, if you can, to stay one extra day after he is out of the woods. I will ask you to sit at his kitchen table and to drink his coffee with him. On the morning, he is well enough to drink it. I will ask this because he has not, in 12 years, sat at his kitchen table with a woman who was not buying flour. He will not know what to say. He will say it badly, but he will not have said it in 12 years. I think he will be the better for trying. Sincerely, Pete McAllister. She set the letter down on her lap. She did not look at Reuben Halstead's face. Reuben Halstead did not say anything for a long second. Then he said, in his rough but slowly healing voice, "Pete McAllister is an old fool." Alma said, "He is." Reuben said, "Pete McAllister is a good friend." Alma said, "He is." Reuben said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." Alma said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "I would drink coffee at my kitchen table with you this morning, if you would sit." She stood up. She set the letter on the small wooden chair. She walked to the iron stove. She picked up the small tin coffee pot. She poured 2 tin cups of coffee. She brought one to him. She set the cup, careful, in his good left hand. She sat down on the small wooden chair across from the bed. The two of them drank coffee at the kitchen table that was 3 steps from the bed. He did not say anything for the first cup. She did not either. They drank. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The first cup of coffee at the kitchen table of Reuben Halstead's cabin took 14 minutes. The second cup took 30. Alma Whitcomb stayed in the small, narrow room at the back of Reuben Halstead's cabin for 16 days. She stayed for the first 10 days because the wound needed daily care. She stayed for the next 6 days because the wound was healing well, and Reuben was eating again, and Pete McAllister had ridden into Cold Creek for new supplies, and the snow had come down hard between the cabins. She did not mind. She slept in the small, narrow room. The door had the small wooden latch Reuben had spoken of. She used it. He did not knock on it. He did not, in 16 days, come closer to the door than the kitchen table. But the kitchen table was 3 steps from his bed. The bed was 3 steps from her door. The cabin was very small. They sat at the kitchen table for breakfast every morning. They sat at the kitchen table for supper. Every evening they drank coffee in between. He could not yet stand for long. He could sit up. By the 11th day, he could walk the 4 steps from the bed to the table without leaning on her arm. By the 15th day, he could split a small piece of kindling with his good left hand. They talked. They talked first about her practice in St. Joseph. He asked what babies she had caught. She told him. He asked if she had ever lost a mother. She told him she had not. He asked her how she had learned the herbs. She told him about her mother in Lancaster County. He asked her about Henry. She told him about Henry. She told him about the riverboat and the cholera and the $42 death benefit. She did not cry. She had not cried about Henry in 2 years. He told her when she was finished about his own dead wife. Her name had been Mary Halstead. Mary had been a small, thin woman from Indiana. Mary had been 30 when she died. Mary had died of childbed fever in the autumn of 1872. The baby had died with her. The baby had been a boy. The boy had not been named. Reuben had buried them together in the small clearing behind the cabin, under the tallest of the 3 pines. He told her, the night he told her about Mary, that he had not spoken Mary's name aloud in 7 years. Alma said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "I have not spoken Henry's name aloud in 2 years either. Not to a person." He said, "Why tonight?" She said, "Because you spoke Mary's. I felt it was fair." He nodded. He said, "Fair, on the morning of the 17th day, with the wound closed cleanly and the fever long gone and the pink color back in his face and the 12 pounds he had begun to put back on showing. In his hands, Reuben Halstead said at the breakfast table, "Mrs. Whitcomb." Alma said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "I am well enough to ride. By the end of the week I will be well enough to chop my own wood. I do not need a healer at my bedside any longer," she said. "I know," he said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Yes," he said. "The $200 in the leather pouch is yours. Pete McAllister has paid you. I will pay you another $50 from the box on the high shelf for the 16 days of work. That comes to $250 in all. $250 is enough to keep you in St. Joseph for a year. You may take the next wagon down to Cold Creek and the next train east. Pete will drive you down whenever you say. I will not stand in the way." She did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that what you want?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. He did not say anything. He looked at the kitchen table. He looked at his good left hand on the wood. He looked at the small carved oak box on the mantel above the iron stove. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb." She said, "Mr. Halstead." He said, "I will tell you the truth. Pete McAllister wrote you a letter without my leave. I should be angry about that letter for the rest of my life. I am not angry about that letter anymore. I have not been angry about that letter since the third day I drank coffee with you at my kitchen table." She did not look down. She did not look away. He said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, I would not have you go down the ridge." She said, "Reuben Halstead." He said, "Alma Whitcomb." She said, "I would not go down the ridge." He said, "Alma." She said, "Reuben." He said, "There is a thing I would say to you. I will say it badly. Pete said in the letter that I would say it badly." She said, "Reuben, say it however you say it." He said, "Alma Whitcomb. There is a verse my own mother read at her own table in Pennsylvania when I was a boy. The verse was from the small book of Ecclesiastes. The verse said, 'Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow.' I have remembered that verse for 40 years. I have not in 40 years had a fellow to lift up. I have not in 12 years had a fellow to be lifted by. I have been one. I have not been two." He paused. He said, "Alma, I would be two." She did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Reuben Halstead." He said, "Alma." She said, "I would be two." He said, "Alma." She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you stay?" She said, "Yes." He'd said, "Will you marry me at the small Methodist church in Cold Creek on the next Sunday? Reverend Pike is in town." She said, "Yes." He said, "Alma." She said, "Reuben." He said, "There is one more thing." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have not held a woman's hand at my kitchen table in 12 years. May I hold your hand?" She said, "Yes." He set his good left hand on the kitchen table. She set her right hand inside his. He closed his hand around hers, she thought, sitting at his small kitchen table with her hand inside his, and the fire ticking in the iron stove and the snow outside the window. Of one thing she had not thought of in 2 years. She thought of Henry. She thought, very small, of the line he had said to her on the porch in St. Joseph the night the doctor told them about the children. She thought, "Alma, I did not marry you for the children. I married you for the bread you bake on a Sunday." She thought she heard Henry's slow voice say, somewhere inside her own head, "Alma, bake him bread." She did not this time cry. She said, "Reuben." He said, "Alma." She said, "I will bake you bread on Sunday." He said, "Alma, I would like that." The fire in the iron stove ticked. The kettle on the back of the iron stove climbed toward its slow, steady boil. Outside, the snow kept falling on the high south face of the ridge above Cold Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the 3rd week of January, 1884. The wedding was held at the small Methodist church in Cold Creek on the 2nd Sunday of February, 1884. The Reverend Jonas Pike performed the service. He had been 72 years old on the morning he had prayed with Alma Whitcomb in the wagon stage from Cheyenne. He was 72 years and 1 month old on the morning he married her to Reuben Halstead. He had smiled at her at the front of the small church. He had said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, the Lord did keep him alive until you got there." She had said, "Reverend." He did. He had said, "And he kept your hands steady." She had said, "He did." He had said then, "Let us proceed." The church was small, the church was full. Pete McAllister stood as Reuben's best man. The Reverend Pike's wife, a small, round-faced woman named Mrs. Lottie Pike, stood as Alma's matron. The freight man who had carried Pete's letter east to St. Joseph sat in the third pew. The freight man's wife sat beside him. Caleb Rose, who had driven the buckboard up to Pete's cabin, sat in the fourth pew. The four other guests were three women of Cold Creek who had heard about Alma's hand on the chest wound and had come because of it, and Dr. Lyle Pomeroy of the small office at the south end of Main Street. Dr. Lyle Pomeroy sat in the very last pew. He had come without an invitation. He had come because Pete McAllister had ridden into town the Thursday before and had told him, in the front of the doctor's office, that there was a wedding on Sunday. Pete had not asked the doctor to come. Pete had only told him that a wedding was happening. The doctor had come. After the service, the doctor had waited at the back of the church. When Reuben and Alma had walked out the front door, the doctor had stepped forward. He had taken his hat off. He had said, "Mr. Halstead, Mrs. Halstead." Reuben had said, "Dr. Pomeroy." The doctor had said, "I would have a word, if I may." Reuben had said, "Walk down the steps with us, doctor." The doctor had walked down the steps with them. He had said on the small snowy walk in front of the church, "Mr. Halstead, I did not ride out to your cabin in October. I should have. I will not, on any month of any year ahead of us, fail to ride out for any cause if my hands are needed. I will say so in the small church next Sunday. I have said so to my own conscience this week." He had paused. He had said, "Mrs. Halstead." Alma had said, "Dr. Pomeroy." He had said, "Mom, I would, if you would have me, be the man to send any patient of mine to your cabin on the ridge for the kind of work that your hands do better than mine. I would not in return expect any patient of yours to be sent to me, but I would in time hope to be worth your trust." Alma had looked at him for a long second. She had said, "Dr. Pomeroy, I will send you the patients my hands cannot help. You will send me the patients yours cannot help. We will, between us, hope that there are not many of either." He had nodded. He had walked back to his own office. That was the last small thing of the wedding day. The wedding party returned to Pete McAllister's cabin for the wedding supper. Pete had made the supper himself over 3 days. The supper was good. The wedding cake had been baked by Mrs. Lottie Pike. The wedding cake had been white. The wedding cake had been beautiful. Alma cut the cake with Reuben standing at her side. They served Pete the first piece. Pete had cried very quiet into his beard for 1 full minute when she had set the small plate in front of him. Pete had not cried in 20 years. Pete cried that night. After the supper, the wagon took Alma and Reuben back up the ridge to Reuben's cabin. The cabin would be their cabin now. The small, narrow room at the back of the cabin had been redone in the last week. Reuben had hauled out the small sewing furniture of his dead wife Mary. He had set up the small, narrow room as Alma's practice room. The small leather satchel had a new hook by the door. The small carved oak box was on the mantel. The brown letter was inside the box. The next morning, Alma sat down at the small kitchen table of the cabin that was now her own. She took out a sheet of brown paper. She took out a small bottle of black ink. She took out a small steel nib pen. She wrote a letter. She wrote it slow. She wrote, "Dear Mr. McAllister," she wrote. "I am writing this reply by hand at the kitchen table of the cabin you saved by writing your letter. Reuben Halstead is sitting across from me at the same kitchen table. He is drinking his second cup of coffee. He is reading a small book of Ecclesiastes I brought west in my trunk. He is not coughing. The wound on his chest is closed. The fever has not come back. The pink color is in his hands. He has gained 16 pounds since the day I walked through the door." She wrote, "I write to tell you that the small $200 in gold you spent of your savings was not the price of a bride. It was the price of a friend. The friend is alive. The bride was not part of the bargain. The bride happened anyway, because we sat at the kitchen table for 16 days and drank coffee and talked about our dead and learned that we did not mind each other's company. That was not your Gold's doing. That was the doing of two widowed people who had not in a long time sat at a kitchen table with anyone. She wrote, "I will not, however, let you spend your last gold without a small return. Reuben and I have decided that we will keep half the gold for the cabin. The other half we are sending back to you in a small leather pouch inside this letter. We will not argue with you about it. We have already decided. You will keep your last $100, Mr. McAllister. You will use it to put in a new roof on your own cabin before the next autumn. The roof is leaking. Reuben has noticed." She wrote, "Sincerely, with the warm thanks of two who have become 1.5, and with the warmer thanks of one who would not be alive without you, Alma Halstead." Reuben Halstead, who is signed below in his own hand. She slid the small steel nib pen across the kitchen table. Reuben took it. He signed his name. He signed it in the slow, careful hand of a man who had not signed his own name since he had signed the deed to the cabin in 1872. He set the pen down. Alma folded the letter. She put the letter into a brown envelope. She sealed the envelope with the small red wax stamp that Reuben kept in the small wooden drawer of the kitchen table. The stamp was a single letter R. She set the small leather pouch with $100 in gold inside the envelope. She gave the envelope to Pete McAllister herself that afternoon when Pete rode up with his wagon to bring a small load of cornmeal. Pete had taken the envelope. He had looked at her. He had looked at Reuben on the porch. He had said, "Mom." She had said, "Mr. McAllister." He had said, "I will not, Mom, take the gold back." She had said, "Mr. McAllister, you will. Reuben and I have decided. The decision is firm." He had said, "Alma." She had said, "Pete." He had said, "All right." He had ridden down to his own cabin. He had read the letter at his own kitchen table. He had cried for the second time in a week, and the second time in 20 years, into his own beard. He had used the $100 in the autumn for the roof. The roof was good. The roof lasted. By the count of the cabin Pete would live in for the rest of his days, until the year of his death in the spring of 1897. By that time, Alma Halstead and Reuben Halstead had been married for 13 years. Alma had run her practice from the small, narrow room at the back of the cabin for 13 years. She had caught 140 babies. She had stitched 11 gunshot wounds. She had not lost a mother. She had buried 6 men of the valley, including, in the spring of 1894, Dr. Lyle Pomeroy, who had asked her on his deathbed to be the one to lay his hand on his own chest, because he would rather hers than any other. I will tell you one last thing. The brown letter that Pete McAllister had written from his own kitchen table on the night of the 17th December 1883 sat on the mantel above the iron stove of Alma and Reuben Halstead's cabin for the rest of their lives. The letter sat inside the small carved oak box. The small leather pouch sat beside the box. The wedding bands inside the box were now 3. Alma's mother's, Henry Whitcomb's, and the new band of Reuben Halstead, given to her at the small Methodist church in Cold Creek on the second Sunday of February 1884. That is the end of the story.